suggesting otherwise. He looks affable, but he can be mean. He's got an impressive, he can be deadly, yes he can. So I want to make sure I make that very clear. An absolutely critically important constituency, this academic community in military ethics. But again, we've got many stakeholder communities, right? And we're tasked with products and services that support staff, faculty, the leadership of the Naval Academy, certainly big Navy. The Marine Corps asks a lot in terms of products and services, other government agencies, NATO. We've been involved in writing NATO Partnership for Peace curriculum for many years now on a variety of kind of related topics to ethical leadership and character. But again, I think it was clearly that Ed and David's tuition was clearly validated that this is a time of great need for this particular topic. But yesterday was kind of the final piece of the puzzle for me personally, seeing it kind of come together, that it's not only what we need in this year, but it's also kind of what we want. I mean, it was a fascinating setup yesterday in many ways. The conversations framed some things out. Probably like many of you, there was many things I agreed with that I heard yesterday from the panels and keynotes. But there were also things I disagreed with. But without question, all of it is something I really learned from. And I'm really excited about the direction that this conversation takes today, because we go from kind of the large framing of what can be, at least on its face, kind of abstract conversations, but knowing that this is not about academics just talking to other academics. We've got future leaders of the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Air Force in this audience. And in so many ways, of the many stakeholder constituencies or communities that we serve, that's the one, of course, closest to our heart. That's the one that Admiral Stockdale certainly would have us target most squarely in all of this. And having had an opportunity to speak with many of the cadets yesterday afternoon into the evening and other midshipmen, it's very clear that, like me, they took away a lot. And I'm really confident that today we're gonna get back into some things that, again, we're gonna learn a great deal from. So with that, Chris, I commend this to your capable hands to moderate the next panel to help us learn yet more.
Thanks, sir. Appreciate it.
Chris.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. And good morning. I'm Lieutenant Commander Chris Hart, a submarine officer and assistant professor of law here at the Naval Academy. And I am thrilled to have two fantastic panelists here today who are going to delve into the challenging legal and ethical issues associated with the possession, the possible use, and the threat to use nuclear weapons. As many of you probably know, because of the Naval Academy's contribution to our submarine force leadership and the important role submarines play in strategic deterrence for this nation, we graduate more people into this line of work than almost any other institution on the planet, making this an especially important topic for us to discuss here today. Our panelists are Dr. Janina Dill. She is a professor of global security at the Blavatnik School of Government of the University of Oxford. She is also a fellow at the Trinity College and co-director of the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law, and Armed Conflict. In 2022 to 2024, she co-convened with Scott Sagan a research project on the law and ethics of nuclear deterrence, funded by the MacArthur Foundation and hosted by the Harvard Belfer Center. Our second panelist is Dr. Steve Fetter. He has been a professor at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy since 1988. Dr. Fetter is a member of the National Academy of Sciences Committee on International Security and Arms Control and have served on Academy committees to assess various issues related to nuclear weapons. He is also a member of the Union of Concerned Scientists Board of Directors, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists Science and Security Board, and the Board of Editors of Science and Global Security. As with the prior panels, each panelist will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we will have 20 minutes for question and answer from the audience. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Dill.
Good morning. My brief was to reflect on whether the US nuclear posture now complies with the laws of armed conflict, LOAC for short, and how we might evaluate this ethically. I just completed research on this topic with Scott Sagan. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to share my thoughts with this distinguished audience. So thank you to Ed and thank you to the Naval Academy. So when nuclear weapons first were heaved into existence by the Manhattan Project, and for some decades thereafter, their use in compliance with LOAC was really inconceivable. The United States has always practiced counter-force targeting, so holding at risk the adversary's nuclear and conventional armed forces. But consistently during the Cold War, nuclear plans also envisaged so-called counter-value targeting, which at the time meant threatening populations in cities. To give you one example, in 1963, Robert McNamara reported to the president that 533 US nuclear warheads would be aimed at industry and government targets inside Soviet cities. And if carried out, these attacks were they were designed to, their purpose was to destroy at least 30% of their population and 150 of their major cities. So selecting targets with the express purpose to kill a certain percentage of the civilian population on the other side stands in irreconcilable and direct opposition to two cardinal legal demands: not to intentionally directly target civilian populations, so the principle of distinction, and to actually minimize expected civilian harm as much as feasible. So a variation on the principle of necessity, don't kill more than you can feasibly avoid, and something we now mostly refer to as the principle of precautions in attack. So in the traditional understanding of nuclear deterrence in the United States, it is inimical to international law. And correspondingly, the United States took the position that LOAC did not apply to nuclear weapons. When in 1973, or in the 1970s, the United States considered, or didn't really consider, but participated in the drafting of the first additional protocol, so the treaty that enshrines these legal principles, it entered a reservation to the effect that the treaty would not apply to nuclear weapons. Of course, the United States eventually did not ratify the treaty, and to this day maintains the official position that it doesn't apply to nuclear weapons. Over time, however, so we're talking here the 1970s, over time, about 30 to 40 years, in a process that's mostly not visible to the public, and which we took pains to reconstruct in our research through declassified documents and interviews with nuclear former officials, the United States gradually moved towards accepting the applicability of customary LOAC, so customary principles of distinction, precautions, and proportionality, to nuclear targeting, and at the same time concurrently moved away from counter-value targeting, repudiating counter-value targeting publicly. The process culminated in 2013, President Obama's nuclear employment guidance, which was the first public presidential level acknowledgement, or demand really, that all US nuclear plants must comply with the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precautions in attack. It was also the Obama administration that officially and publicly moved towards a counterforce-only posture. The view now prevails among officials and strategists that the US nuclear targeting unproblematically instantiates the demands of LOAC because it is a counterforce-only posture. I would like to submit to you that this belief in the unproblematic compliance of nuclear plants with LOAC is made possible by US positions on the interpretation, particularly of distinction and proportionality, that stand in some considerable tension with how these principles are generally more widely interpreted by other states and experts. The tension between those widely understood interpretations and US interpretations are partly, though not exclusively, due to the perceived requirements of nuclear deterrence. So the United States didn't simply take LOAC, apply it to nuclear weapons, and shift nuclear plants to be in compliance with LOAC. Rather, instead, what we call creeds about the requirements of deterrence, so untested, deeply held beliefs about the targets that the United States must hold at risk in Russia and China to deter these adversaries from conventional and nuclear attack against the United States and its allies. These creeds influenced how the United States interpreted distinction and proportionality when applying them to nuclear plants. US legal and nuclear doctrine therefore shape each other. In order not to exceed my allotted time, I will give you two examples of the four major tensions that we found between declassified nuclear plants and a proper kind of rigorous interpretation of distinction and proportionality. but to make sure that, the point is that they allow you to keep on the table nuclear targets that in effect stand in tension with a proper application of distinction and proportionality. So nuclear operational plans are obviously classified, but we can tell that there's a lot of long-term consistency in nuclear targeting. And the last declassified nuclear op plans, as well as interviews, suggest that the United States has 4 canonical nuclear target sets or categories of nuclear targets now. The nuclear forces or WMD infrastructure of the adversary. Second, conventional military forces of the adversary. Third, war-supporting industry or infrastructure. And fourth, the adversary's military and political control or leadership. Now, distinction demands that only military objectives are legitimate targets of attack, and they're customarily defined as objects which by their nature, location, purpose, or use make an effective contribution to military action. Now, if you look at these target sets, 1 and 2 quite unproblematically comply with that because they largely contain objects which are military objectives by nature. But what about target sets 3 and 4, so industry and military and political control? Let's start with political control. Article 52.2 of the first additional protocol, which is widely understood to contain the customary definition of military objectives, suggests that only political control targets that actually directly support wartime decision-making count as military objectives. So a large number of ministries, parliamentary buildings, party headquarters, and also the residences of state officials don't easily slot into the definition of a military objective since they don't make an effective contribution to military action. But both in interviews and nuclear directives and policy documents, we found significant evidence for the belief that effective deterrence requires holding at risk not just command and control understood in the sense of military command and control, but the abilities of leaders in China and Russia to command the state apparatus, the political apparatus, not just the military apparatus. So the elements of state power, as the interview there on the slide suggests. The idea really that deterrence requires making sure the adversary understands that nothing of their political apparatus will be left after a nuclear exchange. How can this be squared with LOAC? The United States takes the position on Article 52.2, the definition of military objectives, which is actually out of touch with much of the rest of the world, arguing that also objects which do not directly support military action but merely sustain the war make an effective contribution to military action and are therefore military objectives. It's sometimes, I sometimes encounter contestation about whether this is actually out of touch with the rest of the world, but the military manual of the United States itself laconically warns decision makers that even US allies tend not to agree with that definition. The position on war-sustaining targets is older than nuclear weapons and obviously has relevance in the conventional realm, but is not well appreciated that is actually instrumental in legitimizing and keeping on the table nuclear targets that are said to believe that to sustain the war because they're part of the political control apparatus of the adversary, which is considered needed for effective deterrence. Interestingly, on this question of the definition of military objective, we also found the most direct evidence that the legalization of US nuclear plans actually shrunk target sets. We found that for a long time, the United States, under the third target set, industry targets, really targeted the basically entire industrial apparatus of the adversary. There was a doctrine called counter-recovery targeting, which suggested that everything was a legitimate target, the destruction of which would slow down the re-emergence of the Soviet bloc after a nuclear exchange, the re-emergence as an industrial state. And we found evidence that in 1997, in a presidential level directive at the time, the lawyers took issue with that and said, by the way, that is not how the law thinks of military objectives. It should be war-supporting and potentially war-sustaining industry, but not everything that is part of your adversary's industrial capacity, and that the target set was shrunk or reduced in response. Of course, targeting political control as a war-sustaining object is arguably even more important than targeting war-sustaining industry, because the differentiation between the adversary as a state, so its political power, and the adversary as a belligerent, its military power and command and control, is what the very project of delimiting, of restricting war by law really rests on. So the idea that the United States must hold at risk all elements of Russian state power, of Chinese state power, is irreconcilable not only with the text of Article 52.2 and hence the customary definition of military objectives, but with the purpose of distinction and arguably the laws of war more generally. Of course, if you target that widely, targets, political control targets tend to be inside cities, you would expect catastrophic collateral damage to result from that. And indeed, we found that this is again considered to be necessary for effective deterrence, that in fact targets must be chosen and planned with the view that it's clear that their destruction will cause catastrophic civilian harm, which is understood to be collateral damage, so the question then arises whether or not, or how you can make it proportionate, right? But what I would like to submit to you, that if you pick targets with a view to causing catastrophic civilian harm, the first question that arises is whether that doesn't actually violate distinction. Distinction prohibiting the intentional or direct attack against civilians. So to explain that, you have to allow me to get a bit technical about the understanding of intent in distinction. There is some contestation of what it means to intend to harm civilians and to violate distinction. On the best available understanding, a violation actually means purposively engaging in an attack that the attacker now knows or should know is directed against civilians or civilian object. Intent can sometimes mean knowledge, and it can sometimes mean your purpose, right? And that can sometimes attach to your conduct, and it can sometimes attach to consequences of actions. And my general argument would be that actually purposefully killing civilian is not required for violating distinction. Purposefully engaging in an attack that you know will harm civilians is enough. However, an attack that is appropriately directed against a military objective that you know is directed as such, but that is animated by the purpose to harm proximate civilians, is a violation of distinction. So purpose is not exculpating, but it can be inculpating. There's criminal jurisprudence suggesting that an attack aimed at a military target with a purpose to harm proximate civilians would be considered directed at both the military objective as the target and the civilian population as an animating purpose of the attack, and that neither could be considered harmed incidentally for the purpose of the law or collaterally, as it's mostly put in terms of military terminology. So how to square the circle then? That the United States has adopted a narrow position on intent, right? So that the idea that we can pick targets for the purpose, the deterrence value of creating catastrophic civilian harm without that violation distinction. And we show this in conventional US doctrine, particularly on air targeting, that the understanding of intent for the purpose of distinction is limited to the primary purpose of an action, right? It's again in the Law of War manual, the notion as long as the primary purpose is to destroy a proper military objective, secondary animating purposes do not imply a violation of distinction. And I'd like to convince you that there is no plausible reading of the intent requirement in any part of law that would make that a sustainable argument, right? If you imagine, imagine you kill your spouse, right? And the primary animating purpose is you want to donate their fortune to a really good cause. You also really hate them, right? And the secondary purpose is that they'll be dead. We would never, in a criminal defense, appreciate the notion that therefore that secondary purpose can be excluded from the question of what was intended. We would probably think of it as the predicate purpose, the death of the person, right? We wouldn't say, well, you had a proper purpose, so it's fine. The death was unintended, right? So this understanding of intent, however, limitation to the primary purpose allows the kind of squaring of the circle between the notion that the United States does not violate distinction in its nuclear plans, but the targets must be picked with a view to the expectation of catastrophic civilian harm. Again, I put some interviews, from actually Stratcom commanders on the slide here. I'm happy to talk about the tensions between further widespread beliefs about proportionality and US nuclear doctrine, but the main point I would like to highlight is that it is not the case that repudiating counter-value targeting and adopting a counterforce-only posture led to the straightforward instantiation of LOAC, that the US nuclear plans for that reason now unproblematically comply with international law. What follows from that? Because you could take the position, right, that you must then abandon LOAC, right? So you have beliefs about what you need to hold at risk, what you need to target in Russia and China for deterrence to work, and they conflict with the most cardinal demand of international law on the conduct of hostilities, distinction, right? So maybe that means you preclude the applicability of LOAC to nuclear plants, as the United States long did. Delegalize, so to speak. This is not a strawman argument. There are respected voices in the community of nuclear strategists that should think that's precisely what the United States should do, not least because it would presumably allow a return to counter-value targeting, which is favored among some colleagues, and I'll let my colleague Steve speak to that. I think that would be a grave error, morally and strategically, right? Delegalization of military targeting in the nuclear domain would have knock-on effects for conventional targeting. When we asked why did the United States accept the applicability of LOAC to nuclear weapons after not accepting it to begin with, it's a process of diffusion, right, that comes from conventional targeting, an entailment. You train a generation of military professionals to understand that the only legitimate way to use military force, the license to operate, is to do so legally. They eventually occupy positions also in Stratcom. The norm that you participate in practices of legality when you use force on behalf of the United States spreads that way by diffusion. There's absolutely no reason in the world to believe that a repudiation of legality in the nuclear domain wouldn't have that reverse effect on conventional targeting. Nuclear targeting is an abstraction, a hypothetical, but conventional war kills thousands of people around the world every year, right? And we heard yesterday about the ethical and moral importance of the law. Helen, Adil, and Dave disagreed on a lot of things, but none of them would have suggested that it would be a moral win for us to remove the legalization out of conventional targeting. And a prominent belligerent like the United States casting doubt over the importance of the law as applied to conventional targeting would have devastating moral costs, will have devastating moral costs. But I'd like to go one step further and suggest that not only should the United States not repudiate the applicability of LOAC to nuclear weapons, but it should actually apply the principle of distinction and proportionality more rigorously to nuclear weapons. And that it could do so without undermining deterrence effectiveness for 4 basic reasons. The first is that these nuclear creeds are actually untested. That's why we call them creeds, right? They're speculative, and there's significant evidence to suggest that they're anachronistic, that the notion that you must target the entire political control apparatus of your enemy is a Cold War reaction to intelligence findings that the Soviet Union was trying to survive a nuclear exchange with the United States by protecting its party cadre. The United States is no longer facing party-based autocracies. It is facing political adversaries that are personalist dictatorships. There's significantly less reason to believe that they value their political control apparatus or their civilian population to that extent. Rather, what they value is themselves and their chain of succession, which law eminently permits targeting, since they're mostly combatants. I'm talking about Xi, Putin, and Kim Jong-un. But beyond that, there's also the question to what extent US posture, particularly the finer points of US posture, actually affect deterrence calculations on the other side. The United States has taken large declaratory steps, like embracing LOAC publicly, like repudiating counter-value targeting. In 2010, also the declaratory shift on chemical and biological attacks. In an extremely dangerous geopolitical moment, these have not weakened deterrence. I ask you, therefore, would it really weaken deterrence, right, to make the doctrinal moves towards a narrow understanding of military objectives and a better instantiation of the criteria of intent? It seems unlikely. And finally, there's the underappreciated notion that in a democracy, one critical weakness in the chain of command is always the question whether a nuclear order would actually be complied with. And there's significant evidence to suggest that illegal threats, or threats where the legality is ambiguous, in at least a culture in which most military operational decision makers in the chain of command are socialized into our culture to the belief that the use of force must be legal, lack deterrence credibility. In our research, we obviously don't have examples for this in the nuclear realm, thank God, but we find some examples where illegal threats of the use of force, particularly under the first Trump administration, lacked deterrence value, and we show particularly this in the context of the threat to target Iranian Iranian cultural sites. Right? So basically, the cost of not applying law or applying it half-heartedly in a way that is contestable are concrete and measurable, whereas the costs of potentially moving towards law more wholeheartedly are speculative as our general understandings are of what exactly it is that deters Russia and China. But I do not want to, and I'll wrap up quite quickly soon, I do not want to actually shirk the real ethical question. So I don't think there is an empirically speaking a tension between effective deterrence and a proper legalization of US nuclear plans. But what if there was, right? What if it actually was true that we can't have both, that we can't maximize the imperative to avoid nuclear war and maximize the constraining of a potential nuclear use by law? We can't kind of exhaustively answer that question, which is a complicated moral question. But I would like to at least take 2 steps at weakening what is probably your intuitive reaction, which is that the overwhelming imperative morally here is to maximize avoiding nuclear war over everything else rather than constraining it, because that's what nuclear weapons are for, right? To avoid nuclear war, not to use them, and to therefore be constrained in a nuclear exchange. The first is that it is generally the goals, utilities that don't have an obvious saturation points are not conducive to maximization, right? It's never clear when we have done enough for deterrence. It's the same with security generally. According maximization or lexical priority to goals like that is a terrible policy choice and has massive moral opportunity costs. Because you should always do more, because you'll never know when you have done enough. And in the process, you might actually undermine the goal itself, and that is the second point, that in fact deterrence isn't the only way to maximize avoiding nuclear war, if that is your utility or goal, right? It is clearly one important mechanism in avoiding nuclear use or avoiding a nuclear exchange, but it is not the only one. And if we only rely on deterrence for that goal, we potentially overlook and weaken other mechanisms. And this is what I would like to leave you with as a thought, that in the attempt to maximize the deterrence value of nuclear weapons, if we trample the law and don't actually uphold the law, we miss on the potential value that law can itself play in avoiding nuclear use and helping with that goal, if you're so inclined to maximize it, that is avoiding nuclear use. Currently, the nuclear space, the public discourse on law and nuclear weapons is bifurcated, with nuclear-armed states and those benefiting from a nuclear umbrella basically trying to avoid talking about law as much as possible. And then the rest of the world seeking to use law to ban nuclear weapons and nothing in between, which is an entirely unexplored space with the potential to explore to what extent legalization and norm building could actually assist in the goal of raising the nuclear threshold and avoiding nuclear war. Thank you.
I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me to speak, even though I know less about ethics and the law than I think any other speaker, certainly much less than Janina. I've been thinking about nuclear weapons for a long time and only became interested in the relationship of nuclear weapons to the law of armed conflict when I was serving in the White House during the Obama administration, and this point was raised during the nuclear posture review and the review of a nuclear employment policy. So I'd just like to offer a few thoughts to stimulate discussion, some of which will agree with Janina and some which won't. The first point is that the ethics and laws of war were developed over a very long period, long before the development of nuclear weapons. The premise was that war would occur, that war was inevitable, and the ethical and legal constraints on the conduct of war were intended to minimize unnecessary suffering, particularly for non-combatants. They were not intended to minimize or even reduce the likelihood of war. And nuclear weapons are, I think, fundamentally different because of their enormous destructive power. That is their essential character. Although nuclear weapons can be used to destroy isolated military targets, they are uniquely capable of massive societal destruction. A single strategic nuclear weapon can completely destroy a major city and kill 1 million people. Dozens of explosions can destroy a country. Hundreds can destroy modern civilization. And because of this unparalleled destructive capacity, all nuclear weapon states have declared that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. All claim to deploy nuclear weapons for the purpose of deterrence, and they deter attack by threatening a nuclear response that would inflict unacceptable damage, damage that would far outweigh any conceivable military, political, or economic advantage that could be gained by an attack. So I think there is an inherent tension between the law of armed conflict, which seeks to limit the scope of violence during war, and nuclear deterrence, which seeks to deter or prevent war by threatening essentially unlimited violence. And for many decades, as Janina mentioned, the United States rejected the application of the law of armed conflict to nuclear weapons. The primary goal of nuclear strategy is to minimize the probability of nuclear war. If deterrence fails and nuclear weapons are used, a secondary goal, and in my mind it's a distant second, is to limit the damage to the United States. I believe that secondary goal is best achieved by limiting nuclear use to the lowest level possible and by ending nuclear attacks as early as possible. And it's not obvious that the laws of armed conflict, laws that were designed, that were intended to limit violence, the violence of war, are well suited to those goals, particularly the goal of reducing the likelihood of nuclear war. And in fact, I believe prioritizing compliance with the law of armed conflict might increase both the likelihood of nuclear war and the damage that would result from nuclear war, as well as increase the costs of deterring and being prepared to wage nuclear war by requiring large and capable nuclear forces. Or it might be more accurate to say that compliance with the law of armed conflict is used to justify and defend longstanding targeting strategies that focus on counterforce, the targeting of adversary nuclear forces in command and control. Now, these are, of course, legitimate military targets. Destroying those targets serves the legitimate military objective of limiting an adversary's ability to conduct nuclear attacks, thereby limiting damage to the United States. So in that sense, counterforce targeting seems to be compliant with the law of armed conflict. Although civilians and civilian objects are not the explicit targets of counterforce attacks, it is recognized by everyone involved that those attacks would cause enormous, almost unimaginable civilian death, destruction, and suffering, both directly from the attacks and because of the collapse of infrastructure that's essential for modern society. Civilian suffering can be reduced to some extent, but through more accurate and lower yield weapons, but it can't be reduced to a level that would be judged acceptable. And that's because many targets, and particularly command and control or leadership targets, are in or near cities, and because missile silos and underground bunkers can be destroyed only with weapons detonated at or near the surface, generating enormous amounts of fallout, contaminating thousands of square kilometers. Because the civilian suffering is unavoidable in the pursuit of a legitimate military objective, and because steps are taken to minimize civilian death, it is, as Janina mentioned, considered acceptable in the United States under the law of armed conflict. Now, I know there's a proportionality test, but I'm going to put that aside for the moment. As Janina mentioned, the ethical and the legal problem is that the unavoidable and enormous civilian suffering that would result from counterforce attacks is widely considered essential for deterrence, an essential component of deterrence. And Janina put some of the quotes up on the screen to that effect. It's also clear from my own discussions with senior military officers and civilian officials with responsibilities for nuclear weapons. If adversary nuclear forces, if missile silos, bomber and submarine bases, and command bunkers could somehow be destroyed with little loss of civilian life and infrastructure, it would not be considered an adequate deterrent. And I agree with that judgment. You can see this very clearly in archival documents in the United Kingdom that debated a switch from an explicit counterpopulation policy that they had throughout the 1970s to counter-leadership targeting, where the goal was to kill the Soviet military and political leadership. The latter was considered an acceptable deterrent only because it would lead to civilian death on nearly the same scale as the explicit counterpopulation attack. But if large-scale civilian death and destruction is considered essential for effective deterrence, then that death and destruction is intended, regardless of whether the targets are strictly military. The civilian suffering is not incidental to achieving a military objective, it is an integral part of the objective. And if large-scale death and destruction is intended, if it's considered essential for deterrence, then I would think it doesn't comply with the law of armed conflict. And there I think I agree with Janina. Now, this is important because most civilian scholars believe that counterforce targeting increases the probability of nuclear war, the damage that would result from nuclear war, and the cost of nuclear forces, compared with deterrent strategies that target civilians and civilian objects explicitly, like energy infrastructure, which are clearly incompatible with the law of armed conflict. Those scholars, which include my former Maryland colleague Tom Schelling, argue that counterforce increases the likelihood of war because there are advantages to striking first or striking very early if one believes that war is imminent, and because of the need to respond quickly to an attack before the adversary nuclear forces and command and control, or before our nuclear forces and command and control are destroyed. And it can also lead adversaries to adopt procedures such as launch under attack that increase the chance of mistakes. And to have any hope of limiting damage to one's own country, a counterforce attack must be large and comprehensive. There's no point to a limited counterforce attack that destroys only a small portion of an opponent's nuclear force. And the capacity to destroy an adversary's nuclear forces and command and control requires a large and alert nuclear force. In contrast, a deterrent force that explicitly threatens civilians and civilian infrastructure could be much smaller and more stable and more likely to limit damage if war occurs. More stable because there's no advantage to using nuclear weapons first or using them quickly. More likely to limit damage because there's no need to launch large-scale attacks, and because the horror of any attack would provide a very strong incentive for a ceasefire. And such a force could be much smaller because, as I noted at the beginning, relatively small numbers of survivable weapons are sufficient to destroy an adversary. This is a very brief summary of a very old debate on which scores of books and hundreds of articles have been written. My point is not to try to settle that debate, but to note two things. First, that compliance with the law of armed conflict is not possible if large-scale civilian suffering is considered an essential component of nuclear deterrence. And second, that focusing on what I would characterize as nominal compliance through counterforce targeting can increase the risk of nuclear war, the damage that would result, and the cost of nuclear deterrence. And I believe that first point is inescapable. Janina doesn't, but as a sort of practical matter of military and political judgment, we've seen that military and political leaders require that capacity for societal destruction as a core of nuclear deterrence. So I recognize that the law of armed conflict has considerable value outside the nuclear domain. I understand that it's difficult to argue that it applies in those domains, but not to nuclear weapons. I understand that non-compliance in the nuclear domain would have adverse consequences for compliance in other domains. But I think we can't avoid those problems by pretending that counterforce is compliant with the law of armed conflict. Now, I started by saying that I don't know much about law or ethics, which should be apparent by now, but let me end by suggesting a possible resolution to this tension. It's usually assumed that threats of force should be held to the same standard as uses of force. If a particular use of force would be illegal, then a threat to use that force in that manner would also be illegal. If it would be illegal to detonate nuclear weapons on cities for the purpose of killing civilians or destroying civilian infrastructure, then it would be illegal to threaten to do so in retaliation in order to deter an attack. So this argument about threats being held to the same standard as use is clear in the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice. But suppose that one could establish that such threats to use force in a manner that would be illegal if carried out, significantly reduce the risk of nuclear war compared to all the alternatives that were judged to be legal. Couldn't such threats then be justified? Compliance with the law of armed conflict is important, but avoiding nuclear war is also important, and I would think even perhaps more important. And isn't the most ethical nuclear policy the one that minimizes the risk of nuclear war? Thank you.